Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thank you so much for having me. I feel incredibly honored to be here. Especially, I just want to give a quick shout out to Bob for bringing this opportunity to me and asking me to come in today. And I'm very excited to share with you some of my research from what seems like a life ago. I've been at the Historical Society since 2021, but prior to that, as Errol mentioned, I was at the Museum of the American Revolution, and while there, I worked on an exhibit called When Women Lost the Vote, a Revolutionary Story, 1776 to 1807, which we're going to talk a little bit about today. Usually when I discuss this, it is a very long presentation, so I've tried to give you an abridged version of it. And I usually have some visual aids as well, which I don't have behind me on a PowerPoint screen, but I do have some on the Chancellor table right in front here. So after my talk and after service, if anyone's interested in learning a little bit more, you can come and see some of the things that I will be speaking about. So 2020 marked the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution that granted American women the right to vote. But women, as well as free people of color, voted in revolutionary America over 100 years before the constitutional amendment guaranteed that right nationally. Today, I'll tell you a story that centers on revolutionary New Jersey. Who would have thought? And the little-known period under the New Jersey State Constitution from 1776 to 1807, in which women and free people of color legally voted in state, local, and federal elections. But this isn't just a story about New Jersey, it's also a national story of hope, potential, and backlash in the early years of America's revolutionary experiment. It shows us that history is not always an upward progression. In 1776, Americans declared themselves a new nation founded on the premise that all men are created equal. But who did this apply to? Who was included under this revolutionary promise? New Jersey stood out among the revolutionary states as the only one to explicitly extend the vote to women, and yet in 1807, after 30 years of that experiment in democracy, New Jersey stripped the vote from women and people of color. What happened to these lost rights? And what can we learn from New Jersey's distinctive story about what it takes to gain rights and also how to protect them? And most importantly, why did women and free people of color lose the vote in New Jersey in 1807? Of course, in order to understand how women lost the vote, we first need to understand how women in New Jersey got the vote. Obviously, there's a lot happening before the war in the old world of monarchy and hierarchy, and some women, of course, did step into positions of power. But I think that a lot of these answers can actually be gleaned from women's roles in the Revolutionary War, because it really did change women's lives. It opened opportunities for women who capitalized on the changes that were wrought by the revolution and the disruption that it caused, and the inroads that the war would provide for women and their political, social, cultural, and of course, economic status. You may know some of these women, like Mercy Otis Warren, a very famous female politician, Phyllis Wheatley, the nation's first Black female published poet. But of course, I think there's perhaps the best known of these women, which is Abigail Adams, who in 1776 wrote a now very famous letter to her husband, John, urging him to, quote, remember the ladies. In this letter, Adams questions women's place in the new code of laws. But what's most interesting is the dialogue that surrounds this letter. In his reply to her, John dismisses Abigail. He calls her saucy. He says, quote, we know better than to repeal our masculine systems. I know. An aggravated Abigail, of course, wrote back to her husband, but before she did, she does what many women do. She wrote a letter to her best friend, Mercy Otis Warren. She said to Mercy, she said, we need to petition Congress. Well, unfortunately, we don't know what Mercy Otis Warren wrote back. I have my guesses, but we don't know what she wrote back. But we do know that about 10 days later, Abigail wrote back to John. And this is what she said, quote, but you must remember that arbitrary power is like most other things which are very hard, very liable to be broken. And notwithstanding all your wise laws and maxims, we have it in our power to not only free ourselves, but to subdue our masters, and without violence, throw both your natural and legal authority at our feet. Mic drop. Abigail's correspondence with her husband suggests that she was advocating not just for women's rights and representation in government, but also for more property rights and other legal protections for wives within marriage. And although these letters were, of course, private, they key into a crucial moment of the revolution, one in which women's status and citizenship was being questioned. Of course, Abigail was not the only one that was questioning the status. So was New Jersey, who in 1776 wrote a constitution that did not exclude inhabitants from the vote based on race or gender. Instead, it used the neutral term they in its section on voter eligibility. So a voter only needed to be able to meet a property requirement. They needed to be 21 or older. They had to meet the residency requirements. And other than that, anyone in New Jersey says the 1776 Constitution could vote, and it created an opening. Again then in 1790 and 1797, New Jersey became the first state to explicitly enfranchise women by describing voters in their election law as he or she. At the museum, we called this the revolutionary she. Now, of course, there were limits of, which women were actually able to vote. And we know that they could vote, but the question then becomes, did they vote? Most evidence of women voting in this earlier period was largely anecdotal. Things like newspaper accounts that were reporting on women showing up to the polls, but having any actual substantial primary source evidence of women casting ballots was very slim. Until 2018, when, while working at the Museum of the American Revolution, I discovered 9 poll lists identifying 163 women and at least 4 free men of color who cast ballots in New Jersey from the years 1800 to 1807. These were in state, federal, and county elections across the state of New Jersey. These lists show, and again, you can see some of the photocopies of them below, that for the first time, not only were women voting, and sometimes in large numbers, but that they were active participants in the political process that shaped the new nation. They were not merely passive witnesses or bystanders of the new democratic system. These lists serve as an entry point into the unknown lives and experiences of the first generation of women and free Black voters in the United States. We can learn from looking at these lists about their experiences, their families, their backgrounds, when they voted, why they voted, who they voted with, what their political affiliation may have been. Women who are voting with male and female family members and friends. For instance, women who show up on poll lists together that are also showing up together on their lists at their churches that they're attending. Married women potentially voting despite being under the English common law's femme coverture. The lists allow us to trace these women's history of property ownership, their relationships, their religion, their marital status, again, of course, also their political affiliation. And while we have not yet identified women of color on these lists, that doesn't mean that they aren't there. We just haven't yet been able to identify them yet. This research, of course, continues. And as I mentioned, we have been able to identify at least 4 free Black male voters on these lists as well. And again, you can see some of those highlighted names on these lists if you come and check out the table below. A lot of people think that what's happening in New Jersey was happening in a vacuum. Loud? I have a tendency. I teach and I'm in a microphone, so let me know if it's too much for you. Women voting in New Jersey was not in a vacuum. It was one of many symptoms of a national phenomenon, both influencing and influenced by revolutionary ideology and talk of women's rights, not only in the States, but also across the Atlantic. This new kind of women's rights talk emerged in the 1790s, and along with it, a new generation of women activists, intellectuals, educators, and politicians. These women pushed gender boundaries and advocated for equal rights for women in Europe and America. An upsurge in women's publishing in the post-revolutionary era accompanied a call for women's rights and inspired a dialogue between these women activists. Of course, while white and middle upper class women were among the most vocal and visible advocates for the equality of the sexes in the early republic, they were not alone. Women of color, and even some men too, voiced their support for women's equal opportunity, especially when it came to things like education. Mary Wollstonecraft, for example, which I think is a name that may not need an introduction, one of the most groundbreaking feminist treatises, Vindication of the Rights of Women, was published by Wollstonecraft in 1792. But we have women who are writing here in the States, Judith Sargent Murray, for instance, who's writing The Gleaner years before Wollstonecraft even publishes Vindication, speaking for and advocating for the rights of women. We have women like Susanna Rowson, whose first publication, Charlotte Temple, in 1794, though published anonymously, became America's first best-selling novel and launched her literary career. That same year, Rowson opened Slaves in Algiers, a play in Philadelphia that solidified her reputation as an advocate for women's rights. And that is because Rowson personally delivers the epilogue for this play. She went on to stage and stated, quote, "Women are born for universal sway, men to adore, be silent, and obey." I know, there's a lot of these mic drop moments from these women. This seems like a very progressive moment in many ways. So I know the question you're all asking is, what went wrong? Of course, all good things come to an end, and in 1807, the state of New Jersey stripped the vote from women and free people of color and redefined the electorate as free, white, male taxpayers. So why? And this isn't just women and free people of color, this is also immigrants in the early republic as well. So the change in the election law in New Jersey came on the heels of a new era of partisan rivalry in the new nation between Federalists, led by John Adams, and Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson. This rivalry came to a head in the 1800 presidential election when Jefferson, of course, defeats Adams. However, despite his national victory, New Jersey voted Federalist. They voted for Adams. The election results sparked a conflict between the two parties and provoked increased accusations of voter fraud across the state. Yes, as you will soon hear, history does have a tendency to repeat itself. Many of them accused people of voting that were not legally entitled to, i.e. married women, enslaved people, immigrants. And the accusations of voter fraud culminated in 1806 following a disputed election over the location of a courthouse in Essex County, which may not seem like a big deal to us, but apparently thousands more votes were cast for that election than there were eligible voters in the county. In these claims of voter fraud, the claims are that men were dressed as women and going to vote at the polls twice, that poll inspectors and judges were leaving the ballot boxes unattended, that women were being pulled off of carriages and told to go cast their ballots. Needless to say, the statute passed unanimously. And this is what initiated the move toward white universal male suffrage in New Jersey and, of course, other states as well. But women voters especially were targets in these petitions of voter fraud. They increasingly became targets in the press and satirical newspaper articles, which referred to them as the petticoat electors and Wollstonecraftians. In one quote from the Sentinel of Freedom in 1798, although reinforced by the petticoat band, true Republican valor they could not withstand, and of their disasters and triumph will sing, for the petticoat factions a dangerous thing. I know. So while the partisan race in New Jersey first made New Jersey women active participants in the political arena, as more women voted and as talk of women's rights came to the surface in the early republic, critics began to satirize women's role in politics. Women voters became to be viewed as a threat and no longer an attribute to the political system. And as the first era of partisan politics in early America developed, Female empowerment and political women became a lightning rod for this deep partisan division. But New Jersey women losing the vote in 1807 is not the end of this story. It never is. As they were pushed out of politics and the public sphere, especially into the early 1800s and the coming of the Victorian era, women activists turned to educational initiatives to prepare young girls for future political participation. Many opened schools and female academies, which laid the groundwork for white women, as well as some women of color that were educated in these schools, to launch the middle-class reform movements of the 19th century. Susanna Rowson, for instance, in 1797, opens the Young Ladies Academy in Boston. Judith Sargent Murray, who I mentioned earlier, opens a school of her own in 1802, right outside of Boston. And it's this next class of women who would become the next generation of women activists, reformers, and suffragists. One of them that you may be familiar with is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Most people know, especially here in upstate New York, about Susan B. Anthony's attempt to vote in Rochester, New York in 1872, but very few know about her sidekick, Elizabeth Cady Stanton's attempt to vote when she lived in Tenafly, New Jersey. In November of 1880, Stanton, accompanied by Susan, went to the polls in an attempt to vote. She asserted that while she was banned by law from voting, her right to vote was grounded in the foundations of New Jersey's revolutionary history. In her published account of the event, Stanton declared, "I am here as a United States citizen to vote for United States officers. It is not the duty of a town inspector to decide on my liberties." As to a precedent, there are many precedents for women's voting. Women are voting on school questions in 8 states of the Union today, and on the sacred soil of New Jersey, where we now stand, women voted for 31 years from 1776 to 1807. This next generation of suffragists were evoking the memory not only of the Revolution and the early Republic, but of the nation's first women voters in New Jersey, to ground their position in America and its founding, and to assert their right to equal citizenship. Of course, while New Jersey suffragists campaigned for suffrage in the state in the early 1900s, they had pushback again as well. Groups like the New Jersey Association, opposed to women's suffrage, were saying that basically doubling down on these calls that said that women should have the vote by saying that these early women voters were actually accused of voter fraud, that they shouldn't have actually been legally able to vote, and that ultimately women are participating in voter fraud still even today in the 1900s, and giving them the vote would not purify politics as women claimed that it would. Of course, in 1915, the New Jersey state referendum to give women the right to vote is denied, fails to pass. In New York, for example, the referendum is not passed until 1917. But this is what women and minorities were up against, not only in the 18th and 19th centuries, but clear into the 20th century as well. For decades, charges of disrupted elections in the early 1800s remained a source of ammunition for enemies of women's suffrage. So as you can see, the story of women's suffrage is one of ups and downs. It ebbs and it flows, and we watch as democracy expands and contracts. But this is also a story of hope and inspiration, that the fight for women's equality in the Revolutionary period did not end with the loss of the vote in 1807, but rather that earlier fight became a rallying cry for the redemption of the suffrage movement decades later. And most importantly, this story is a cautionary tale. It suggests that progress is not necessarily linear and unending, but that rights and liberties require constant vigilance to preserve and protect. And these groups, particularly minorities and women, continue to work to combat voter fraud and suppression, even still today. And they still struggle for equality and social justice. So I hope this can serve as a call to action to all of us. That this story teaches us that voting rights, or any rights for that matter, do have the ability to be taken away. And it is our duty as citizens and community members to ensure that our rights are secured and protected for all people. And that is the only way that we can hope to move toward building a more perfect nation. Thank you. Thank you.